a breath in and exhale. One more time.
Thank you so much, Cantor Will, for opening us with that beautiful music and a way to get centered on this night in which we are going to be looking at prayer. My name is Bill Danaher, and I'm the rector of Christ Church Cranbrook. My colleague is Mark Miller, who is the rabbi of Temple Bethel. And then with us tonight, we have from the Christ Church Cranbrook side, Manisha Dostert, who is senior associate rector. We have Chris Harris, who is the associate rector. And then we have our theologian in residence, the Reverend Dr. Michael Battle, who is coming from New York City and is at General Seminary. And of course, we have Cantor Will, but I also saw Cantor Kamowitz. She just got into the here, so we're well staffed for music and prayer in many ways. Mark asked me to do a little opening, and then I'm gonna turn it over to him, and then we're gonna move into this time together. And we will be listening and watching the chat. Father Chris is gonna be monitoring that chat and curating it so that we can have good conversation and opportunities to interact with each other. Our work together came about because of friendship, and also from the need that we have in this time and place to know one another better. And for Christianity, that means learning to see Judaism as still covered in the unbroken promises of God and as our spiritual forebears. And that work has been incredibly enriching to me. I am so grateful for the opportunity to know that. And for those of you who are part of our two congregations, there was a recent article in the Jewish News about our space sharing that we're doing. I just put it in the chat for you all. And my hope is you can take a look at that, because part of what animates the work that we do together is not just that we're going to be sharing office space and classroom space and even social space for the next 2 years, but also that we are going to take this time to get to know one another better. And Mark and I came up with a shared vision that we want to move to a deeper level than a lot of interfaith relations typically go. Most communities that are of different faith traditions, when they get together, there are moments of prayer, sometimes at moments of crisis. There's moments of sharing, but there isn't a kind of deeper dive into our traditions. And so a couple of years ago, we did an incredible project with our nearby partners in the Muslim Unity Center called 3 Languages of Forgiveness. And that was a huge, wonderful evening. And this past year, we've focused on the midrash and the parables. And we're also looking today, at traditions of prayer. And if there's anything that we need to know more about these days is a prayer. I don't know about you, but over the past year, I've both found it difficult to pray And I've found prayer to be like oxygen. I could never quite get enough into my lungs. And so it's that double dynamic, both having a hard time quieting myself enough to pray and also needing that prayer just to negotiate my daily life. So I think it's really appropriate that we turn to do this series and to do 2 sessions each on tradition and contemporary Jewish prayer and traditional and contemporary Christian prayer. And I'll turn it over to Mark Miller.
Thank you so much. And like Reverend Danaher said, it is so nice to see everyone here tonight. I know we've gotten used to seeing each other in this way, which is not our preference, but as long as this is our reality, it is really nice to be able to see so many faces, and the opportunity for us to share this moment really just feels good. And like Reverend Danaher said, this is our second series, and it really is something that grew out of what was already, I think, a wonderful friendship between our communities. And Temple Bethel and Christ Church Cranbrook actually have a lot in common, I would say. Obviously, very different institutions, of course, but if you really kind of get past things like theology and some of the specifics, there's a lot of similarities between what these institutions are, what they mean to the community, where the people come from, the sort of perspectives that we share. There's just a lot of commonality here. And I think that's why there's an easy relationship between these two institutions. And for myself, I will just say also with Bill in particular, I consider him really one of my closest friends in the wider religious community. And I feel very honored for us to be here with Christ Church Cranbrook to do this series. So he spoke briefly about why prayer is important, and I don't want to dive into that myself so much, but I do just want to say by way of introduction that part of the reason that I think we wanted to take this as a topic for our second series is that the language of prayer really is what for thousands of years has allowed us as human beings to connect with something greater than ourselves. And at its most basic sense, that's what prayer is. I think that's what religion is about. And also, I think that's what a lot of what humanity is about, is figuring out what it is that we are part of, what we fit in with, and how we connect with everything that surrounds us. So this really is very fundamental to who all of us are as human beings and as religious people. And it's a great joy to be able to go back and forth and try to learn more about what these different traditions have to say about prayer, both as a theory and I think what it means to us in practice. So tonight, I'm very blessed and honored to be able to welcome my very dear friend, Cantor Rosalie Will. I won't tell you exactly how long I have known her, but it is, let's just say it's approaching 30 years. If you look at her, you would say that's not possible, but we go back a long way, and she is a wonderful cantor, and she's going to explain a little bit what that is for anyone who might not know. A close colleague of ours, Rachel Kalmowitz, is on this Zoom also, and many of you know her, our cantor at Temple Bethel. So they share this approach to Jewish life, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about that. She currently is the Director of Worship and Music for the Union for Reform Judaism. The URJ is our kind of umbrella group for the, call it 850 or so Reform Jewish congregations around the country, really North America. I sometimes forget Canada, that's my bad. But for all of us, it's kind of our umbrella as a Reform movement here. And so she is a resource, a leader, someone who people all around the country turn to for inspiration, for guidance, for expertise. And so she's a perfect person to guide us tonight and again in 2 weeks for what Jewish prayer is all about. And so again, there's lots that we can follow up on, and we'll do that later. But with no further ado, I want to welcome officially to our virtual Bima tonight, Cantor Rosalie Will.
Thank you very much, and Reverend Danaher, Rabbi Miller, to all of you for being here. So we began with prayer, the melody that we sang as a way to center ourselves in space and time. I would consider, perhaps many of us here as well, would consider prayer. Things that provide a break from our normal routine, provide a moment of breath or of shift, or even something that's challenging and new, are the places that sometimes can open us to new experiences. So we did indeed begin with prayer tonight. Um, my role as a cantor primarily is of music. For many in the church world, many communities have ministers of music or liturgists who often do a lot of work around liturgy and prayer. Cantors work as co-clergy with their partners, usually rabbis, in congregational life, involving in life cycles and teaching, really doing a lot of the same pastoral and support work in a congregation as other clergy and invested folks and lay leaders in the congregation. And cantors approach a lot of the work sort of through the lens of music. What are the doorways to meaningful religious life in our world, in a Jewish life? Can we provide music as one of those doorways? And our job is to sort of create the containers for people to experience things through music, through voice, through community, through listening, through heart opening. So that's the sort of lens we walk through the creation of Jewish community.
Cantor, well, by the way,
Yes.
only since she said earlier that that rabbis and cantors are really partners, I feel like it's okay for me to interrupt her briefly. So
Yes.
you'll forgive me.
That I should be a little louder.
There was only one brief thing I forgot to mention at the beginning that I just want to say before she gets going, just in terms of format. So I want everyone to know on the program that Cantor Will is going to be giving us a presentation first about Jewish prayer. During and after, we really hope that you will take advantage of the chat on Zoom here. If you don't know where that is, at the bottom of your screen, you see a little button that says chat. We will be monitoring that and keeping track of comments and questions. So anything that comes up that you're interested in, please put it in the chat and we will do our best to come back to everyone later. But I just wanted you to know that the chat is the place to jump in anytime you want, and we will try to keep track of that as we go.
Great. So I understood it was a little bit hard to hear me. Is this a little bit better? A thumbs up? Good. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. I would hate to have conversations with you and have you not here. So what we're going to do this evening is going to be a little bit more of a historical context and move some into the personal. In 2 weeks' time, when I return, we'll have a chance to really dig more into what we might experience as individuals. I'm going to share sort of an overview of the Jewish view of prayer. Many people might have different opinions or different senses of our history. I'm going to share my screen here. But in general, it's just going to be a brief description of sort of how we got here. I don't need to see this opening slide any longer. So we have been talking about prayer as humanity really since the beginning of time. And there are a few places in our Bible we call for Tanakh, which is the Torah, the first 5 books, our prophets, and all of our writings in the Old Testament. In a few places that I'll just highlight for us here in terms of how long we've been thinking about prayer, whatever that means. I'm not yet sure. Maybe we'll discover together. And Abraham, and the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis, says to his the manservant who came with him, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go. We will worship and then come back to you." So I wonder, what does worship mean? What did they do? Did they have prayer books? Did they have PowerPoint slides? What is it that they did? We know there was no kind of sacrifice, but something happened. They took a pause and engaged in something. Later, when Isaac survives and is an adult, we hear in Genesis that Isaac went into the field to meditate. Again, Isaac meditated. What might meditation have looked like to Isaac? I wonder, was that prayer when Isaac went to meditate, to reflect, to commune? There was no guidebook, no texts, no decree from any divinity or higher power what to do, but somehow Isaac was called. And Hannah, we hear in Samuel, her lips were moving, but no words came out. This famous story where Eli the priest thinks that she's drunk and she has to explain that she was praying. So it makes me wonder in this context for Hannah, how do you know when someone is praying? How do we sit in community and consider what prayer looks like? If we're all saying something together, but some of us are silent, maybe it's because listening is more powerful, or everyone's silent, but I'm called to speak or to sing. How do we make these decisions about what prayer can look like for other people? I don't know, but since the biblical times, I believe there's a wondering. We'll skip ahead a little bit to 70. So after the children of Israel, they're enslaved and they are freed from Pharaoh. They go, they wander through the desert. They receive the 10 commandments. Our story tells us, our tradition teaches. They eventually get to the land of Israel where they begin to set up society. And along the way, they had learned in Exodus about sacrifice, about a ritual, a rite of bringing animals to ask questions of God, to make requests. It's sort of a human instinct to say, if I want something, I probably should give something for that thing. I probably have to negotiate in some way, or who am I to just demand, but I will offer. And sacrifices that were described in biblical times became the centerpiece of the temple. People would bring from all over this area as it was being developed a couple of times a year, special holidays during the week, pilgrimages of animals, of grain, of first fruits, of offerings. Individuals would bring communities worth of stuff all the way to Jerusalem, to the temple, which had been built in Jerusalem, and offer the sacrifices. And there were rituals that the high priests and the priests would engage in with these sacrifices. And the assumption was that would be the relationship between us, the people, and the things we needed. And what, of course, did we need? Most people were concerned about, the environment, about weather in order to provide crops, about good health, about prosperity enough to support our families. And so these sacrifices were brought, the people stayed home, their stuff made it to Jerusalem. The priests would make rituals and rites and offer a reach nichoach, a beautiful smell, to God, to the heavens, and perhaps the prayers would be answered. That was prayer. Well, in the year 70, the temple was destroyed a second time and not to be rebuilt. And so a few things changed. There was no temple any longer. There was no central sacrifice as had been described in Exodus and other places about a lamb that was unblemished, all of these details about what should be brought, where to bring it. There was nowhere to go. So the sacrificial cult, as we call it, that experience at the temple was no more. The local gatherings had to replace what our emissaries used to bring to Jerusalem. So now we're in our town. There's nowhere to send anybody, but we still would like rain or sun or good health and prosperity and our community to survive whatever ailments were coming or trauma was headed our way. So we had to gather together and say, well, now what should we do? And they created rituals. They created, basically with language, new ideas and new words to give voice to what they were asking. There was a sense that without the priests and all of the very specific rites, they couldn't be replaced. So the communities gathered and said, well, we might be able to offer a few things here, but really we're just asking for good health, asking for certain things to happen. And people would improvise. They would free form, just like we might now. If we were to take a moment, I said, what do you hope for tomorrow for yourself and your family? And you might share what that was. Those were what the prayers became. So in this period, we call it the early rabbinic period, from when the temple was destroyed and we're sort of scattered, the Jewish people become very scattered. There is no fixed prayer, but there are a bunch of benedictions that develop over time and topics. And in Hebrew, we call it the Chatima, which is the sort of last line of a prayer, which would be sort of the, if you read a nonfiction book, sometimes at the end, there'll just be the summary paragraph. Like if you skimmed or lost the thread, if you need to take away a few key points, like here it is, the end of many of our prayers would just have a key point. Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, God, who brings on the evening. Okay, there was a lot of other words about nighttime, but ultimately we're grateful that the sun has set and we're able to sleep. So these benedictions were created as just ideas of what the kinds of things we might pray. But every time a group gathered, there were new elements. If it was very rainy, the benedictions we offered would be about, we'd like some dry times now. Or if there was a particular political situation evolving, we would pray that that certain things would turn out a certain way, all verbal and all fairly improvised. Between the 6th and the 9th century, by the 9th century, we had a written order of service of Jewish prayer where these benedictions were put in an order. We'll touch on it a little bit in a few weeks, based on a loose structure going from sort of universal gratitude towards just the planet, the things moving around in the universe, toward our own particular experience as Jews, into some personal prayer and reflection. And it was loosely written out, but again, there was no printing press. So cantors, chazanim, another word for that, or ba'alei tefillah, prayer leaders, had to sort of think about these orders of service, and they would use various gimmicks, we're told, acrostics and other songs to try to remember, wait, what order were we supposed to deliver the prayer? And of course, as you can imagine, Jews were spread all over the world. Imagine if you and your family spread, or even generation to generation, and you tell a story and everyone tells it a little differently. Over time, lots of different communities developed their own. They either didn't remember the order or they lived in a different place where their needs were different. The weather was different. Their need to pray for rain shifted because they were in a very rainy climate and they needed to pray for dry land. So one of the challenges as we sort of move into what this means for more contemporary thinking about prayer is that the Torah didn't have fixed instructions about how to pray. And even remember those first 3 quotes, Abraham said he and Isaac were going to worship. Isaac meditated. Hannah muttered, but moved her mouth, but no sound came out. Nowhere in the Torah, in the first 5 books of Moses, did it say, God said you should pray at 7:30 in your sanctuary, or God said you should pray at 8 or 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. That didn't come from our biblical experience, but it did talk about sacrifice, about bringing offerings, bringing something of yourself as a way to communicate with the divine in some way. In Hebrew, it is called avodah, this sacrifice, which also is translated as work or service. You would bring your service. And now we think of prayer as avodah as well, our service, but it isn't particularly precise because we don't have the sacrificial rules. And in Judaism, our prayer rules are not quite as strict as maybe that sacrificial rite would be. As it evolved, as I said, because it changed and shifted as it moved all over the world, it's a lot looser of a structure. So we're in some tension sometimes about, is there a right way to do it, as there might have been with the sacrifice? And we didn't do it. The priests were responsible. But now we all are responsible for our own prayer. A little more, and I encourage you to consider sort of the ideas or what they might evoke for you. Maybe not so much the Hebrew if it's more challenging, but think in your own tradition or your own experience as we just look at 1 or 2 more concepts together. In Jewish life, when we think about prayer, we talk about the keva, which is the fixed required liturgy. The certain prayers that would appear in every service, primarily in the same order. And then there's the kavanah, which is the intention. I could just say a bunch of words on a page. I could read my notes today, and it would be keva because I typed out some information on a slide. But my kavanah, my intention, would be to inspire you or to add a little or to remember a story, to bring myself to it. That's a kavanah of why does it matter to me? The words are the same, but I'm different. The words never change. I change. I change each day, each week, each year, and that's the keva and kavanah. The challenge is that before we had a printing press, and once we had the first printing press, one rabbi's kavanah, one rabbi's idea, today I am moved by the way the sun sets and the stars appear, got written down and became our keva, became our fixed prayer. So this is the prayer that we say for the evening. And that's the challenge and the interesting opportunity where we are in as Jews who engage in prayer. One generation's kavanah, just intention, idea, moment becomes another's keva. One example is that in an Orthodox liturgy, there's a blessing for the leaders of the Babylonian academies, of the schools of thought in the Babylonian time around the year 0. But the doors are long closed. But the prayer is in the prayer book because someone wrote it down. And then there's a question of, but that's not true to our experience. And so the printing press actually locked in some of that in a way that now we have to work around and find ways to bring our own voice, our own experiences, our own unique time in the world too. So some of what I also think about is when we think about intention, what intention you bring to your prayer practice, regardless of language or faith, we all might mean something different. And what does it mean for you to bring intention to something? The words might be familiar week after week, or the melodies might be the same, but where and how do you bring your selfness to those experiences? Last little bit, if kavanah, if your intention is important, what language should we be praying in, particularly what we think about as Jews, because our language of prayer and of Bible is mostly Hebrew and some Aramaic. Maimonides, one of our great scholars, said all benedictions may be said in any language. The Shulchan Aruch, explanation of really unpacking some of the rules of how we might consider living our Jewish lives, said a man can pray in whatever language he desires. And interestingly, the word for prayer in Hebrew is tefillah, which comes from a reflexive word, lehit palel, which doesn't mean to pray, it means to judge oneself. So there's also this interesting exploration of, again, what do we bring? What language speaks to me? How do I bring myself to the prayer in those moments? So the one other thing I'll say, and some of the things we'll talk about in a few weeks and going more personally, is again this tension of what's fixed and what we bring, true in any liturgical tradition and any place that I've seen or been. I noticed the topic of this is sort of our exploration of prayer and God. I didn't mention God, and we'll do that in a few weeks, which again is, what is the purpose of prayer? Is it to be in relationship with God? Is it to be in relationship with each other? Is it both? How does our prayer provide that opportunity or sometimes get in the way of that? And really, what is the purpose of prayer in Judaism today? One of the things that was always helpful to me when I was studying in seminary, one of the things I learned when we first began to unpack prayer, particularly this question of prayer books, and I know in every faith tradition, prayer sometimes change, and there's that tension of, well, it shouldn't change, but it's a traditional, or there's understandable anxiety, not just about loss, but about doing it wrong or of upsetting some kind of through line. And what was helpful to me, one of my teachers, Rabbi Larry Hoffman, taught us in school, and I often come to it when I'm also feeling somewhat resistant, is he would say the Siddur, which is the Hebrew for prayer book, which actually doesn't mean prayer book, and it doesn't mean prayer. Again, I'm hoping this is helpful to sort of get a sense of how Jews think about prayer, because you notice it's actually not about prayer, it's about judging, it's about the Siddur, the prayer book. Seder, coming up to Passover, many of you might have been to a Passover Seder, means order. The Siddur itself, I could pull one off my shelf, is just an order. It doesn't say God, it doesn't say prayer, right? It's the order of the things that we would do in order to walk through those doorways. And what Larry Hoffman taught was the Siddur is the diary of a people, is a diary. So then I think, if you were in Bloomfield Hills to find a diary of someone who lived in Bloomfield Hills in 1880, or in 1640, before anyone was here, or in 82, I probably knew Mark then, like whatever that diary said, you would find interesting and informative and exciting and confusing. But I doubt you would say, well, we should probably live our life according to that person's diary from that time, even though they're in our town, in our village, maybe we found it in our backyard. So the interesting piece about Jewish liturgy as it's evolved is that the prayer book that was printed, five of us had some great ideas of how we asked for peace, how we remembered the Exodus from Egypt and freedom. We wrote it down, and it finally got stamped into a printing press and 1 million copies made. That was just one person, persons identified as man, idea of the way to say the prayer. A few of our prayers are from the Bible. They're lifted up as biblical text, but most prayers were written by human beings in their diary. this thing happened, and I really hope that this other thing gets resolved. And then we have 1,000,000,000 copies. So again, the interesting thing about Jewish worship is that we have this beautiful guide, this Seder, this order, which we'll explore in a few weeks, how to look at the universe for everybody, for all humanity, all living things. And then what is our sacred story as Jews? What is our relationship? What have we learned about our experiences? But the words aren't necessarily ours. They might represent, we might find ourselves in them, but they're not ours. And so we do this dance of fixed prayer. And what do I bring to prayer, excuse me, generally? But also, what do I bring to it this week? Last week, I felt this week, this prayer for freedom, there's a lot of slavery in my world, and I'm, okay, I get some people were free, but why not everybody? The prayer is always there, but I'm allowed to sort of find my way through, and music often is the vehicle for that. So I think I'm going to stop here. This was sort of the end of some of the historical context for how we came to have the Siddur, the prayer book, and the prayers of our people, but what we as Jews are sort of thinking about how we relate to it. So I will mute for a moment and see which of my colleagues wants to can I just take this question? Larry asked, what am I telling you by putting she, her after my name? I'm telling you that I identify that my pronouns, if you were to refer to me, are she or her. It's quite possible that I might use different pronouns, even though I visibly might present female automatically. It could be that I identify as a different gender, not what I physically appear to be. So it's a way of telling you that I use she or her pronouns when you refer to me. Thank you for asking. I meant to say that early on, so thank you.
So Mark, I think we were gonna turn to Michael for a response. That'd be great.
And maybe
Thank you.
just before we do that, sorry, Reverend Danaher, just because I don't know if we've done this for this community, I don't know if everybody knows who Reverend Battle is. So maybe you could just do a quick introduction so that people know who's kind of giving this reaction to Cantor Will's presentation.
My pleasure. So Michael Battle at Christ Church Cranbrook is our theologian in residence. This has been one of the great privileges that we have because of the pandemic, is we were able to make use of someone who spends most of his time teaching in a seminary in New York City as our theologian in residence. So Michael has been with us at our adult education classes, and things are beginning to look up as the possibility of actually seeing him in real time in the physical form, maybe by the end of the program year. Michael's background is that he has he's probably one of the leading figures in spirituality within the Episcopal Church. He has written important books on the Black church tradition, as well as important biblical interpretations of the Book of Revelation. His primary work has been with working with Desmond Tutu, with whom he stayed at some pivotal years in the early 90s, living with Tutu and working with him during the early time of the transition to a democracy in South Africa and the work of the TRC, although that came, I think, just after Michael left. His writing on Ubuntu theology is considered canonical for anybody who wants to know the South African story theologically. And currently he's completing a book will be released on March 4th, I believe, which will be a biography of Desmond Tutu. So that's a little bit about Michael. And
Thanks
we've
so
known
much,
each other
Paul.
forever. Yes.
Thank you. And Rosalie, thank you so much for, helping us to get into the deep waters of prayer and the Jewish tradition. What strikes me, I'll just put this out, maybe as grist for the mill for a conversation, but I really liked how you actually modeled what you were saying. As we came into our session together, you or using wordless prayer. And also, as you went through the methodology of the roots of Jewish prayer, from not being fixed to being communal, I think you've also modeled that too, with how you've articulated prayer as both fixed and as well as intentional. Some other things that really struck me is the question, how do we know when we're praying? And as you went through the traditions of that, especially the movements of Jewish people in the diaspora, the difficulties that were in the history of Jewish people around the temple, the need to try to find common prayer. To me, that is a deep tradition that I think Christians need to be much more aware of. And also, I think you mentioned just briefly, although you weren't trying to get us to have a specific definition of prayer, but I really liked what you were saying to me that helped me to understand prayer. You said the experiences of being open or opening to new experiences. And I really love that as a way of understanding prayer. Those experiences that help us to be open to God. And I know at Christ Church, Cranbrook, since I'm resident theologian, I can sort of claim that as my identity as being at Christ Church, Cranbrook. There is a commonality also to how prayer is not just through words. In the Anglican tradition and probably in Roman Catholic traditions and Eastern Orthodox traditions, prayer is often sung. And in other more Reformed Christian traditions or Pentecostal or charismatic traditions, prayer is mostly through words. And so the tradition that you're giving us of understanding the roots of Jewish prayer is important for Christians to understand that prayer isn't ultimately through the concept of saying words. And I think your insight for us, teaching us more about prayer is deeply insightful. I also think that as you've gone through sort of these traditions of the roots of Jewish prayer, you've hit upon something that we all should really think about, and that is, what language should we use when we pray? I think that's a deeply important question, because around that question of the language we use in prayer is also a lot of politics. It's a lot of who belongs and who's out. And what I love about the Jewish tradition that I've always held close to my own Christian spirituality is that the understanding of God has to go beyond words, the understanding of God has to go beyond these definitions that we place on God. And I think that question of what language should we use in prayer is profound. And as I'm just closing in terms of what strikes me, and hopefully others will have other questions, and Bill and Chris and Manisha may want to just chime in with me before we open up for a larger discussion, is that the way we understand Jewish prayer in the Christian tradition is often seen as complicated in terms of we do not know the language. We do not know Hebrew. Those of us who are ordained in the Episcopal Church, especially, if you were Presbyterian, if you were in those sort of traditions, you would learn Hebrew. But in our Anglican tradition as clergy, we really weren't encouraged to really know the biblical languages, except for maybe if you were going to do a PhD in theology. So this question of what language we use in prayer it would be interesting for us as Christians to understand that the use of Hebrew in our own Christian worship would be a profound way of understanding, as Bill was saying, our relationship to the community that pre-existed us as Christians. So those are some of my responses, and hopefully they were provocative enough to invite more conversation.
I think we're going to turn it
That
to
is-
Mark. Yeah.
So thank you, Reverend Battle. That was a fascinating response, and in particular, maybe Cantor Will could start with a little bit of a reaction to that question about language, because I think that's just an interesting one, and maybe a big difference between our traditions in terms of how we utilize language. But just quickly to let everyone know what our plan is, we have Cantor Will with us for about the next 15 or 20 minutes, and so we're going to try to, I think Pastor Harris is going to lead in asking her some of the questions that came up in the chat. And then after she is finished, the rest of us are going to jump in there and wrestle with some of these ideas publicly, and we'll see who comes out on top. But as I said, for now, maybe Cantor, if you would mind giving us a bit of a reaction to that question of language, and then Chris is going to jump in with more questions for you.
Great. Actually, John just put in the chat what sort of I was going to respond to. Do we know what language God understands? And a sense of both right and wrong, but who are we to know? And I mean, some of our teachers also say that even to pray is an act of great, Jews would say chutzpah, like boldness. Like, who are we to think actually that we would be having a conversation, as it were? And so again, I think a lot of the Jewish attitude towards prayer, at least the liberal attitude, things have evolved in different traditional branches, but my expertise is really in the liberal tradition, is that we pray not for God, but we pray for ourselves. That's pithy and very loose and does not encompass everything, right? So it's just it summarizes, and it's too banal in a way. But to say language, for example, and everyone's theology is different. I'm sure Mark and my theology in Jewish, that's another conversation. Jewish views of God are diverse and divergent and change. We don't believe in a sort of single idea, but my philosophy, and I think many would be, there's not a God head, a God unit that is listening or hearing specific words or not specific words. That when we pray, we are changed. It's like pulling a boat from the shore, right? If you saw in a distance someone pulling a boat, it would look like they were getting pulled towards the boat, and really they're pulling the boat towards themselves. The idea is that we change through the act of prayer. God doesn't change. Who am I to change God? We change. So the language piece could be, for many, Hebrew is either historical. Many of our prayers are actually in Aramaic, which many of us don't know, but it was actually the vernacular language when many of the prayers were written. So to us, it would be English and Hebrew. For historical Jews, it was Aramaic and Hebrew. But for some, just the sounds, or just like the wordless nigun, yababai, or yalalai, or ooh and ah, are just sounds that can evoke different ideas for us. So whether it's English, or if you're in a French synagogue, just like if you're in a French church, it's French, and perhaps if there's another language like Latin or Hebrew or Greek, the languages are as much, I believe, about sounds. Sometimes it's a way of not knowing. It's an excuse a little bit around, I'm not sure about this theological statement, or I'm not exactly sure I believe this anymore, but if I say it in a language that isn't mine, I don't have to be faced with it. There is some of that truth in how we think about our prayer. But again, also a sense of the unknown. These are words, I don't really know what they mean, but it might let me leave the intellectual, my native language, I can translate and understand and process and break apart. A different language create some freedom. But I don't think it's for God as much as it's to help us move forward in some way. So thank you for, Reverend, for bringing up that question about language and your response to it. I appreciate that. And I think it is a big question and something to play with.
Okay, I might go ahead and just throw
Chris.
some questions at you.
Yes.
If you're ready for this, the
Yeah.
chat was really active. So thank you everybody for throwing out these questions. I'm going to combine a whole bunch of them, I think, into one
Super.
and see how this works. But there was a lot of comment in the chat about types of prayer. In the Christian tradition, for example, you often hear things like, well, there's 5 types: adoration, petition, thanksgiving, intercession, that sort of thing. Someone else mentioned in their Orthodox tradition, they had help us, save us, have mercy on us, keep us as types of prayer. The question I might have for you and maybe the panel is, what's the, in a kind of more Jewish tradition, do you have that same type of understanding of types of prayer and maybe the role? Yeah.
Yes, we do. I think it might be Anne Lamott actually who says this, but we've adapted it, that you can sort of summarize all of prayer into help, wow, and thanks, and please, right? 4 things like help me, wow, please may I have this, the thing that I need, and just gratitude. But interestingly, all of those are at play in all of our sort of singular services. In that Siddur, in that order, we in every service sort of encompass all of them. So, and I don't know enough about different Christian faith traditions to know whether they are separate sort of times and organized differently. And of course, I'm sure in other traditions as well, there's sometimes more of some during some parts of the year. Right. So like for our Yom Kippur, when we're doing a lot of reflection, there's a lot more sort of please and thinking, maybe less wow. Or at Passover, when we're celebrating freedom, we sort of think more about gratitude, about how we got here. But in every service, we could look at each of the prayers and we could identify which ones were wow or thanks or please. But the important part, I think, in Jewish liturgy, and when those diarists wrote down their diary and it got codified, were already well aware that a spiritual life or a prayer life, again, I don't know that they imagined what prayer would look like, but that to travel through the world, all of those things had to share space, that you couldn't just have please, please, please without wow or thanks or help. And to someone's question about, does God respond? I think the assumption was not that God would directly respond, but that we would feel by articulating it that something had happened. So all of them, I think, are encompassed in prayer. I mean, Mark, maybe your experience is different, but that's how I'd answer that. That was a good bringing it all together, Chris. I'm impressed.
Any other further responses on that? Well, otherwise we can go to the next one, which is kind of related. And that is, particularly you started off with the temple system. And it was a good question on the relationship between sacrifice and prayer. I know in the Christian tradition, for example, we often get into a bargaining with God. If you just give me this, I promise I'll do that, or I promise I'll never do that again, or that kind of thing. Where is that in your, you want to speak to that a little bit as well?
Sure. And I think someone also asked in the chat, sort of in biblical times, was there a sense that God would respond? I mean, different theologians have tried to unpack sort of the biblical view of God as it evolved, which changed, I think. But I would say that many liberal the service itself, I can't speak to what people sort of want in their hearts, but is designed that we don't necessarily believe that God is involved with each person directly. Individually, that God is God doesn't do the things, God just is the thing. There's been always a little getting a little theological, but as it relates to prayer, so that God can't necessarily do or not do, but God is the allness of everything. And so the prayers, there might be bargaining, but from what I understand from individuals, but also the way our prayers are designed, is the bargaining, again, is less with an expectation of a response and more, I think, of doing our own inner work of if, I'm hoping something would happen, God. And so if I just, I have teenagers, if I'll, studying for a test, please, God. I think that our prayers, and not just many of us where we are in our world, is really designed to say, there might not be direct action, but by being in community, we are held up. by articulating our needs and wants, whether it's that test or a clean bill of health when we go to the doctor. We're articulating our yearnings, we're articulating our vulnerability, we're articulating our fear. But when we do it in community and we say, oh, I'm not alone here, that's where the God to me sits in prayer, is the sense of I'm struggling, but I don't have to struggle alone. Whether God helps me or things work out and I ascribe it to God, everyone's theology is different, but the prayer service, different than personal private prayer, communal prayer is as much about, oh, I'm in this together. I've suffered a loss, and Chris, you have something joyous to share. And in that time together, both are going to exist. I am racked with grief, and you're bursting with something amazing, and we make space for each other. That's what the prayers and the service is designed to construct for us. I might have diverged a little bit in part because the theology is tricky, but that's how I'd answer that.
Yeah.
I
Where are we?
just
Where are
want
we at with in time, friends? Do you want to add some more voices?
Yeah, we
to
did.
that?
I think it'd be nice to hear what Michael says.
Yeah, I just responded to that, Rosalie, in case some of us who are in the Christian church may feel a bit estranged. I want to say that it's the same thing. What you are teaching us is the same thing as understanding that when we pray, we're not informing God about anything God doesn't know. And so the wisdom that you're saying that when we pray, we're praying for ourselves. God already knows what our needs are before we ask them. And I think in much of Christian practice, those of us who are praying are really trying to inform God because of our suffering, naturally, to change the circumstances. But Rosalie, where I'm seeing the same symmetry between Christian theology and Jewish theology is that we're not informing God about anything. We are in prayer trying to be in concert with God. And I'll say things later on about, in Christian theology, we actually have a concept that God prays. But I agree with what you're saying, Rosalie, but for those who may not understand that really important point, that when we pray in the personal relationship kind of understanding of prayer, we have to keep in mind that the way we are communicating is we're communicating as human beings, as creatures. And God is not a creature. God is God. And that's what I love also about Jewish theology. You're helping us to understand as Christians how God is God. We can't place our own politics, governments, and all sort of stuff onto that image of God. God has to be God.
And
Can I offer one more just brief thought about that? Because I think both of those were beautiful responses. To me, another important way to think about that is the question of whether prayer is an intellectual activity or an emotional activity. And the reason I put it that way is because, so this will be short, I promise, but I had an experience years ago. I was a student rabbi at a small town in Indiana, and there was this couple that came to our services every time I was there, and our study sessions and everything, and they were from the Assemblies of God congregation, which some of you know is a very fundamental group within Christianity, right? The Assemblies of God. And we got into this conversation one time because this guy told me that he had a personal experience where it had been raining terribly, and he went out of his house at 4 a.m. and was watching the water rise toward his house, and he was watching the water get closer and closer to flooding his house. It was the flood coming, and then he made a prayer, and immediately when he made the prayer, he watched the water recede from his house. And I remember sitting there thinking, I don't even know how to respond to that. To my theology personally, and I'm not saying I'm right or wrong, but to my theology, God is not answering that prayer for the same reason that when one person prays for the Tampa Bay Bucks to win the Super Bowl and someone else prays for the Chiefs to win, there's a problem. God can't do everything. So I don't necessarily believe in that direct action. And yet that I know is an intellectual response. And sometimes the prayer is emotional. There are things that we want. There are things that we need. There are things that we desperately hope for. And maybe that is conveyed in prayer in a way that isn't just about the response or lack of response, but is about that connection that I think both of you just described. Right? It's part of the question of what the intention is of that prayer.
I just wanted to thank that was so beautifully put, Mark, because I think that, from my perspective, not that I want to get into this, but I try to make that prayer true for everybody so that everybody has a home that has waters that recede from it. And that's kind of my, that doesn't help me with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but it helps me with natural disasters. Like when someone says, God saved my house in this flood, how do we make that prayer true for everybody? Even those who lost a house. I wanted to just do a quick pivot to Rosalie. The thing that I thought was so mind-blowing about your presentation to me is I find, particularly as a Christian going through this pandemic, where I can't celebrate the sacrament of Christ's body and blood, for me, that's analogous. And I want to stress the word analogous. It's not the same, but it's similar to the trauma of the loss of the temple, in that it's a devastation. And one of the things that I was reading again during the pandemic was a book on sacrifice by Moshe Habertal, who's one of my favorite writers. And when you made the connection between prayer, rabbinic prayer as it generates, and the loss of the temple, it named for me one of the things that Habertal lifts up when he reads through the tradition of seeing the rabbis begin to couch all of their prayers as another kind of sacrifice. And so one that came to mind was Rav Shishit, who wrote a prayer that says this: Sovereign of the universe, you know full well that in the time of the temple, if a man sinned, he used to bring sacrifice, and all that was offered of it was its fat and blood, and atonement was made for him therewith. Now I have kept a fast, and my fat and blood have diminished. May it be your will to account my fat and blood, which have been diminished, as I have offered them before you on the altar, and do a favor, and do thou favor me. And I found that, so that was like the early point where the fasting that you would do was akin to the sacrifice, and it was from there that you can build a whole tradition. And for me, as a Christian, that helped me see the prayers that we were doing on Sunday online as shaped by the sacrament that we had lost. And it also reminded me of the way in which Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, there's an echo through not just prayer, but also works of love or charity, all the other things. You could see the echo of sacrifice, which is why there's the chutzpah, of praying. And you lifted it up so beautifully, and it's been something that I've struggled articulating, and I'm so grateful that I've had that guidance over the past year, because our prayers have had to become sacrificial. They had to become a kind of echo of the sacrament. And you wanted to finish with another song.
I did. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll end as we began. I'll leave and let you continue this beautiful conversation. I'm really looking forward to being back in 2 weeks. And Bill, what you said also reminded me that even after the temple was destroyed and this loss, reverberated, and the loss that you and your community, that all of us have felt, in how our prayer has had to change, and for some very traumatic and others less so. And like any prayer, when we walk away and we can see hope, I'm hopeful, or I imagine that maybe these new ways of praying have also provided beautiful opportunities. You know, the liturgy and the words we now have as Jews, we wouldn't have had the temple not been destroyed. I would have given my offering to someone else who would have taken them to the temple where someone else would have sacrificed. But now I get to do my own work. I get to be a part of my own prayer experience. So with the loss, we hold equally the opportunity and the learning and the growth. So we'll hum a little or sing or just take a rest or take your sip of water, whatever feels good for you in this moment, and then I'll leave and see you in a few weeks. Grateful for the time. Enjoy your evening, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Rosalie, thank you so much. It's so good to be here with you, to be learning with you and praying with you again. And we are really looking forward to learning more with you in 2 weeks. I can't wait to be here. It is great to see your face and to hear your beautiful voice. Thank you. And now I want to just let everybody know that we will be continuing our conversation tonight with the clergy from Temple Bethel and Christ Church Cranbrook. So we look forward to continuing our conversation.
I will say that as Cantor Will just departed, so this is behind her back, but relatively brief presentation that she gave, obviously. But like Chris said, the chat was filled, and not just comments, but I mean, I'm sort of stunned at the breadth of what came up in these questions, and really, I think, deep questions that came up as a result of that presentation, which maybe shouldn't be a surprise, because we all framed this evening by saying prayer is a central thing to faith and to our lives. And so as we start unpacking what prayer is and how it works and where it came from, it leads to really big questions. And so again, I think we're going to want some of us to kind of jump into this conversation. And I want to start that by just offering one other comment related to the question that came up earlier from Reverend Battle about language. And there also was a question that showed up in the chat that there were a couple questions. Someone said, when we pray, why not pray in the language we know? You know, why is language important? And then there was another question that said, do we know what language does God understand? If we use the wrong one, will we be understood? And I think that's actually a really powerful question about how do we connect? And to me, that takes me back to a midrash. And just for anyone briefly, midrash is not in the Bible, but midrash is a collection of reactions basically to the Bible that are considered sacred text in Jewish tradition. So midrash really is sacred text, meaning it speaks for tradition, even though it isn't technically in the Bible. So there is a great midrash that talks about the moment of revelation. So we're talking about the moment on Mount Sinai. And there is a sense that the first two commandments were spoken directly by God, and the rest were then spoken through Moses. First two were spoken directly by God. And what the Midrash says about that then is that part of the reason why that was important, and also, by the way, connects this to another tradition that says at the moment of revelation, all sound on earth stopped. All the birds' wings stopped beating. The wind stopped. There wasn't a sound in the world except for the sound of that revelation of God's voice. And so the Midrash picks that up and suggests that part of the reason it was so important that the voice be clear is because every human being heard God's voice differently. You would think, the natural thing would be to think in that moment, it's one voice. God's voice is coming out and everyone would hear that. But the Midrash says actually everyone heard it differently, in different languages, in different styles, different volumes, whatever people needed, however they needed to hear that, they did. And that was the nature of God's voice, was to be heard differently by everyone. So to me, that connects directly to this question of what does it mean when we pray? If God can speak to us all in the language that we need to hear, my assumption would be that God can also hear us in whatever language we present. And similar to that, there's a great little story about a little boy in a temple somewhere who didn't know how to pray and didn't know how to read and didn't know what to say. And he sat there just reciting the alphabet. And all these learned adults were kind of laughing at him saying, how silly, he's just reciting the alphabet, until the true wise one said, actually the kid himself responds and says, I don't know those words, I'm just giving all the letters and I know God is going to put them in the right order for me. So my response would be that yes, whatever language we use, God will hear and understand. And I think the language matters because of us, not because of God, but because it feels different for us when we pray in our native language versus a foreign language versus an ancient language. There was a question that came up in the chat about when Latin entered the service. And I don't know if someone else might like to take that as a bit of a different twist on this question of language.
Yeah, I mean, Latin came in when the church was decriminalized, and then eventually became known as the official language of the Roman Empire. And I mean, one of the things that I think we should always be asking ourselves, I'm not saying we should stop using Latin, but when we do use Latin in our prayer, I mean, that's a language of power. That was the product of empire. And it's just something we should think about. I don't want to, this is what I've experienced is people love Latin because it seems to convey something important from years past. But it may not be in and of itself worthy of our ultimate allegiance. And I do think, as I heard Cantor Will say, the tradition within Judaism didn't say that Hebrew was normative, but it is something I think it teaches us to learn a different language in a sense, or our own language, and it's about performing identity that's at the core, and I find that helpful. I don't think that Christians have a long history of that. We part of it is internal to our belief in incarnation, which is behind the vernacular, believe it or not. So there's been a pressure within Christianity to translate from the beginning.
I'd love to add something else to this discussion about language, which is, I don't know if anyone else noticed, but after all this discussion about language, Cantor Will did what is called a nigun, a song without words. So a whole nother option for us, right? We've got our traditional languages, our Latin, our Hebrew, and then we've got English that most of us are speaking all the time, and then we've got songs without words. And the benefit of a song without words is that anybody can sing it, right? Anyone can take part. There's no barrier. In addition, we can say whatever we're needing to say in that moment. So a nigun, sometimes I will begin a service with a nigun and end a service with that same nigun, that same song without words, and it will be a completely different experience because I am different at the beginning of a service than I am at the end of a service. And every person who is participating, who is singing along with me, also is having their own experience, and they can say whatever is needing to be said, whatever is in their own heart at that moment can be said in that nigun. So I wanted to point that out, in addition to just mentioning that another thing to think about with Hebrew is because there are so many layers when you're talking about Hebrew, and like Rosalie mentioned with the word lahitpalel, to judge, to pray, these different, the ways things work, there are these roots, these 3-letter roots in Hebrew. And so there are all these relationships and different meanings. And so sometimes there's just a different depth when you say it in Hebrew than there may be when we say it in English. And I know for myself, I feel like having both the opportunity to sing or speak in Hebrew and having the opportunity to sing or speak in English, I feel like I gain something different from each of those moments, and they are both important in my sense of prayer, both in leading and in experiencing prayer.
So I know this is a bit of a jump here, but and this is not a question for the Jews among us as much, but for everyone else, have you heard of Yiddish? Right? I'm guessing some people have heard of Yiddish, right? This language that is spoken. So for those of you who have heard of Yiddish, do you know what Yid means? Right? The root of that, the language is Yiddish, but it starts with a Yid. Any of our clergy friends happen to know? So I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but a Yid is a Jew. And it occasionally is used as a pejorative, but it really isn't. It's sort of just a basic term in a different language that means Jew. So sometimes what you will hear people say, and this is more, sometimes some of my older Jewish friends or my grandparents might say this, but they would say something like, oh, that person is speaking Jewish, or this is this person's Jewish name, right? Where they meant Yiddish name, or they were speaking the language Yiddish, but it literally, Yiddish means Jewish. You're speaking Jewish. And part of why I think that's a fascinating connection is because prayer is one element, obviously, of leading a religious life of whatever language, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, right? Prayer is one part of that, but leading a religious life is about a lot of different things. And you can do that both in language and in action and in, acts that you do with your hands. You can do that in lots of different ways that aren't only in prayer, but you can do them all in ways that I think are prayerful. And to me, one of the questions, and this goes back to actually the first question that was asked in the chat, the very first question, and I think this was related to Cantor Will's presentation, but somebody said, what is the relationship between sacrifice and prayer? You heard Cantor Will, I think, say, and again, her presentation was fantastic. It was also obviously brief, intentionally. So, couldn't go into all the detail, but she talked about how prayer really evolved, Jewish prayer evolved as the sacrificial system waned. But the question was asked in the chat is, what is the relationship between sacrifice and prayer? And not to put anyone on the spot, but I'm wondering if either Cantor Rachel or one of our other colleagues might be willing to react to that question. What is the relationship between sacrifice and prayer?
So in discussing sacrifice to the temple, right, this is something that that we, as Cantor Will said, we have this idea, we give it off to somebody, they take it up to the temple. Sacrifice was something we were no longer able to do when there was no temple. And so therefore we needed to find a way to connect with God, and we needed to find a way to use our own words and our own voices and our own bodies in order to connect with God. And so I think all the different ways that we can pray, which can be, with our bodies, with our minds, with our voices, with our mouths, all of these different ways that we can pray are our way of doing what was happening with sacrifice back then, which was of offering ourselves to God, of offering ourselves in service, right? We talked about the word avodah, which is sacrifice and is service and is worship. And so the opportunity to offer ourselves in service, to offer ourselves in worship, is the way that we can use prayer now, and that what sacrifice was used back when there was a temple.
Reverend Battle, could I put you on the spot perhaps?
Sure. I appreciate that, Rachel, what you're saying. I think in sort of the Christian theology, what we understood as Jesus being Jewish, he was teaching us a similar worldview, that if you are just using words and not offering yourself, then the words are meaningless. So in other words, Jesus was teaching us that you had to have the symmetry between what you were saying as prayer and what you were doing with your behavior. And I think so sacrifice for us as Christians, there's still that worldview. I know it may not seem like it, since in Christian theology, we believe sacrifices ended in Jesus. But in the language and the cosmology, the worldview that Jesus was teaching, when we are offering ourselves in service to others, that's the ultimate sacrifice. As Jesus would say, no greater love than someone who has laid down their life for their friend.
So, that I'm going to have to dwell on that response a little bit. And, I appreciate, part of why I personally love this series that we're doing is because I feel like, I've learned a fair amount about Christian theology through the years, sometimes almost accidentally. But, there's such open doors, and it really is a different approach, fundamentally different approach. I know we're all on the same path and we all connect to the same God, but it's a very different approach, in that way. And part of what was interesting to me was what you just immediately took that to was the concept of Jesus being the final, and I think maybe you said the ultimate sacrifice. And I don't think you said this, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think part of what I heard was you saying that is also our, it's meant to be a role model, right? You, as Christians, you look to Jesus' sacrifice and say, therefore, what's my path, kind of in that regard. There's some sense of doing the same. Is that going too far, or is that a fair paraphrase?
Yeah, I was saying that in much of Christian theology, we understand Jesus as the final sacrifice, but if you look at Jesus's teaching, he's still carrying in his teaching the concept of sacrifice, as what Rachel was saying in terms of not being able to go to a temple. Now you are offering your prayers as sacrifice. So yeah, I would say that's pretty much the sort of cosmology of most Christian theology, that Jesus is the ultimate and final sacrifice.
So the reason why, again, for me, the reason that was so important, so interesting, is that in Jewish tradition, sacrifice obviously is central to the history. It was central in the transition to prayer directly, but in our tradition, there is really no sense of looking at sacrifice as something that we are part of in that way, right? In the same way that you would present Jesus. So the Hebrew word for a sacrifice is a korban. It's a korban, and that word, the Hebrew letters in there, the connection is it means to bring close to something. So if you were to do a literal translation of sacrifice, it isn't about sacrificing yourself or even giving up, right? The way we use sacrifice in English, right? You sacrifice something, you give something up. But literally what the word means for us in context is a system to draw yourself close to God, right? So you sacrifice so that you can become closer to God. Cantor Will use this phrase, a reach nichoach, this beautiful aroma. And it, just viscerally, picture, a fire with something on it and the smoke goes up to heaven, right? It's the most direct thing. Literally, this is going up to where God is, right? In that sort of ancient mindset. But that's the best way for us to draw closer is through this. But it's a different thing to draw close as opposed to give oneself up or give oneself over in that sense. And I guess what that leads me to wonder, and Reverend Danaher, I don't know if you'd want to take a stab at this, but given that perhaps the roots of sacrifice are really interpreted differently by these two traditions, what does that lead to in terms of the way we think of prayer?
Yeah,
if prayer evolved out of sacrifice, if we look at sacrifice different, what does that tell us about how maybe we look at prayer differently?
without question. I mean, I think we could spend a whole another series on sacrifice, because from my perspective, and I always feel free to just speak freely. I think that sacrifice, no matter what tradition, is a ritual that will be patient of many interpretations, right? So it's a ritual act that's going to contain elements of it are going to be the act of it, the service of it. Some of it will be the offering. Some of it will be the drawing close. Some will be what ascends to God. So we'll continue to find folds within our two traditions that are going to go into that ritual from a number of places. And I think that the one thing I would say that from a Christian perspective, the prayer will constantly be interacting with all of those things. So sometimes you'll be engaging in certain prayers that are going to be penitential. And so you'll be just doing that service and trying to go through a fast or go through repetitive prayers to somehow get through to God and to be released, to feel released. And then some in the Christian tradition, there's also going to be other prayers where you're offering something through either giving up or giving away something that is a kind of symbolic act. So I do think that sacrifice is going to, and it recurs. And the one thing I want to say about Michael's position that I'm sure he, is embedded in what he was trying to say, and it's important for us to say, is that within this, the biblical record, there's the faith of Christ. So what we are following when we look at Jesus, we're looking at how he practiced his Judaism as instructive. And then there's the faith in Christ that Christians have, where, the greater theology, which I like to teasingly call the sacred cult of personality of Jesus, takes over. And so it's in there, you're going to have a whole nother theology of sacrifice. So you're going to see Jesus doing the things that a faithful Jew does. And as we saw with AJ, there's a lot of stuff in there that is just really fruitful for us to see. And then there's the faith in Christ that begins to emerge in the other texts of the New Testament that are the epistles and the pastoral letters and things like that, where you'll see Christ being elevated and treated as a kind of sacrifice. And so all of this is to say that I think we are going to have different views for sure. And I think what's going to unite us is we're going to have a common set of disagreements Um, and that's going to be okay. And there's going to be a family resemblance. What I do think happens within Judaism and Christianity, and this doesn't happen with every interfaith encounter, I really believe that when this is in the ideal, but when Jews and Christians pray together, they really believe they're talking to the same God. And that's not always the case in other interfaith moments. Like, so I mean, I think that I find that kind of beautiful, because despite the fact that, you know, we have emerged different from a common tradition, we've moved in very different ways. With Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, we still believe at the end of the day that we're talking to the same person, or God, or the same God. And that's kind of beautiful. So I do think as we go through this, it will. I also think that the sacrifice of prayer within Christianity runs like a subterranean river. And so a lot of people will spend their entire Christian life praying faithfully and never be quite aware of that subterranean river. They'll kind of know that where they get the water, but they won't have like gone deep into the kind of the substratum of the theology. I leave that to interpretation from my sister and brother clergy who are Christians, but that's how I would take it.
I would just add, Mark, that I think in our monastic traditions, our Christian monks and our desert fathers and mothers, I think they understood this concept of sacrifice as offering and getting closer to God, especially the whole traditions of how they take vows and eventually become, in some sense, married to God, or in some sense closer to God than those who do not have the time to do that. So I think because your question was how does sacrifice and prayer relate? Because for those monastic traditions, they are trying to actually be in a place of clarity and time to pray.
Well, Cantor Rachel, we began the evening with a cantor from out of town, and I wonder if it would be too much to ask for us to end the evening with our own cantor here, and that perhaps there is a prayer that in Jewish tradition we say on lots of occasions. It happens a lot. It's called the Shehechianu. And this is a prayer that we often think of as a prayer of gratitude. You know, we say it for happy occasions, we say it at, you know, weddings and family events and all these kind of things. But if you really explore this prayer technically, it's a prayer that is it's intended to be said at the first of a repetition. In other words, it's not just something that you say at a unique moment. It's actually meant to be said at the first event of something that is then going to continue. So perhaps this is a way for us to close out this evening with a prayer that will lead us to the next 4 weeks where we're going to have these continued sessions. And again, not to put you on the spot, but Cantor, if you might offer this blessing on all of our behalf, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and everyone else again so that we can hear you okay.
Absolutely. I am happy to share. It has been a wonderful evening, and I'm just so honored to be a part of it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh.
Ah, 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 amen.
Wow.
Those words that she just sang translate to, "Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, who has given us life and sustained us and brought all of us together to this very special moment." And even if we can't hear all of your voices, I hope everyone will join me in saying Amen.
Amen. Thank you all. We're gonna keep the if Cantor, if you can stay as well, we'll do just a little post mortem with our team just to see where we are.
For everyone else, we're so glad you were here. Have a great week, and we hope you'll join us next week. And Reverend Battle will be our scholar for that evening, talking about the roots of Christian prayer. And then, of course, again, we'll be processing it, sharing questions and discussion, and we look forward to it.